Welcome to today's webinar, Everything You Wanted to Know About Licensing Windows Workloads on AWS, but Were Afraid to Ask. Our presenter today is Sean Lewis, and today with us we also have a team of great Q&A moderators, Lance Spratt and Carrie. They're our webinar moderators who will be engaging with you and answering any questions you have throughout the live presentation. Sean, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Quentin, and thank you everybody for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be. Today we are going to walk through some different licensing scenarios to leverage the Microsoft stack on AWS. We offer the ability for customers to license Microsoft products like Windows Server and SQL Server through AWS. We also have options for customers that would like to bring their own licenses into AWS, and we're going to talk through a number of those different scenarios. As Quentin mentioned, we do have a great team of Q&A moderators that are taking your questions. So as things pop into your head, if you've got things that have been queued up in your head around licensing that you want to ask, please get those out to the Q&A team right now. There are already a few in the queue I see, and they're starting to answer those. So thank you for keeping it interactive, and we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A if we have any remainder questions left over. So without further ado, let's hop right in. I'm going to take you through what we're going to cover today in the agenda. So we're going to talk about a couple different licensing scenarios. We're going to talk about traditional enterprise agreement customers that have an EA with Microsoft that would like to bring those licenses into AWS. We're also going to talk about the service provider license agreement, or SPLA, for those of you that have that agreement in place with Microsoft and want to allow your customers to be able to use those licenses in AWS. We're going to talk about license mobility, where you have the ability to bring licenses into AWS in a variety of different scenarios. And we're also going to talk about some common questions or concerns that come up during the Q&A process as well. So let's go ahead and talk about a brief overview of licensing with AWS before we get into some of the details. So Microsoft licensing in the public cloud, there are a couple different paths to do this, right? Multi-tenant public cloud infrastructure allows the ability for customers to spin up instances and spin them down and take advantage of the agility and the flexibility of cloud services. The license model with Microsoft allows for licenses to be brought in under the license mobility software assurance benefit, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But we by default, for customers, when they spin up an instance in the Elastic Compute Cloud EC2, have the ability for that customer to select whether they want the Windows license included. And when you hear me refer to the license included option during the talk today, that's what I'm going to be referencing. Is in the AWS bill, we have the ability to charge the customer for their usage of the Windows operating system, Windows Server, as well as the compute and storage that they're using. And it's all on one consolidated bill. We also offer SQL Server for customers, where they're able to also pay for the SQL Server license there. When Microsoft licenses software and it's used on traditional on-premises environments, there's sometimes a need for identifiable server hardware. That can be the case with certain scenarios with Windows Server or SQL Server, where potentially no license mobility is available, maybe because of a lack of software assurance on that license. We'll talk about that. Or perhaps there's no license mobility in the software assurance benefits for that product, like Windows Server. In that case, we're going to talk through some of the dedicated options that we provide through AWS, both dedicated instances and dedicated hosts. A little bit about our relationship with Microsoft. So we are a gold certified Microsoft partner. We do have our own service provider license agreement, or SPLA, with Microsoft, and we offer products such as Windows Server and SQL Server to customers. We are authorized with license mobility to allow customers to run licenses in the cloud that contain the license mobility benefit through software assurance, such as SharePoint, Exchange, Skype, etc. As always, and I'll kind of caveat this a couple of times through the presentation, the customer is responsible for complying with the product use rights and the terms in the Microsoft agreement. So just make sure that you're double checking and that you're in compliance as you go through some of these different licensing scenarios for yourself or your customers. So let's talk through the license options and what you can do as a customer. So when I mentioned license included, again, that's the ability to pay for the license as you go. You can also make a longer term commitment through what we call a reserved instance purchase, where you can pay in a 1 year, 3 year increment with varying options, no upfront, partial upfront, or full upfront payments to pay for the compute, as well as the license that you're going to be using on that instance. You also have the ability to bring licenses into AWS. And as I mentioned, we have default tenancy for licensed mobility products with active software assurance and dedicated options for licenses that are not eligible for licensed mobility. So let's dive deep into license included instances, what this means. So you may have heard the term AMI, or Amazon Machine Image, before. Essentially what that is an image that Amazon maintains and supports for our customers with a prepackaged Windows Server image on top of an elastic compute cloud EC2 deployment. So you see that we've got pre-installed Windows Server and pre-installed SQL Server here. If you look at the Amazon Machine Image gallery on aws.amazon.com, you'll see, and also in your console as you're deploying new images, you'll see that we have a lot of different varieties and flavors of Windows Server, SQL Server, Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2, Server 2016. Our engineering teams work very closely with Microsoft to make sure that we're supporting the latest images and versions of the Microsoft products. So we do have Amazon Machine Images for SQL 2016 and Windows Server 2016. We also have quite a few that stretch back quite a ways. So this is a very quick way to get up and running and deployed with a Windows Server image that Amazon maintains. Amazon typically publishes a new Amazon Machine Image for Windows Server monthly, containing security updates and other appropriate hotfixes for customers. So a couple of things about the pay-as-you-go option, just to understand. This really takes care of the licensing compliance issues for customers. So you don't have to bring any licenses in, you don't have to count, you don't need to worry about cores or processors or number of users. That's all something that you pay for as part of your Amazon bill. It does eliminate the requirement for the Windows Server client access licenses, and the flexibility of this is really something that we see customers embracing. Think about experimentation or spinning up a workload that you only need for perhaps a couple of weeks and then you're going to spin it back down. That elasticity with AWS provides customers the ability to only pay for that license, Windows Server or SQL Server in this case, on an hourly basis, and then shut it down when they're completed, when their project is completed. That's a great advantage. The other thing is, as you're working on billing and potentially chargebacks inside of an organization, this is a fairly transparent way to get the actual costs back to a cost center or a line of business that's going to be responsible for the project, including the infrastructure costs, all as one kind of consolidated bill through AWS. So as I mentioned, we've got a lot of different flavors of Windows Server available through license included. It does come with 2 remote desktop services instances for administration and management. If you need additional remote desktop services client access licenses, AWS does not resell those, but you have the ability to bring those into AWS. As I mentioned, we have SQL Server 2005 all the way up to 2016. This is all per core licensing. No client access licenses are needed. You can use this both in the Elastic Compute Cloud EC2 service as well as the Relational Database Service RDS service as well. So you have the ability to pay for SQL Server in our Database as a Service RDS offering. The pricing models are on-demand and reserved instances. We also support Spot instances. If you have not heard about Spot or have not read on it in a while, I would really suggest spending a little bit of time. We don't have time in this webinar to cover it, but essentially Spot allows you to bid on unused capacity and pay a lower amount with the understanding that that capacity may go away as another customer assigns it, but it does provide a very economical way to run some potentially non-mission critical tasks where you don't necessarily need the compute running at that exact time. License mobility. I'm going to take you through this a little bit. What is license mobility? We hear this a lot from customers. License mobility is a software assurance benefit. So when you license a Microsoft product, you purchase the license and you have the option of leveraging software assurance and adding that to the license at the time of purchase. License plus software assurance is typically what Microsoft Enterprise Agreement customers have. The Enterprise Agreement is a 3-year agreement, and as new products are added, software assurance is typically added on through the EA as well. You have to maintain active software assurance as a customer. So that means when you renew your enterprise agreement or you purchase that software assurance, it's for a certain term, and you're continuing to pay that software assurance cost through Microsoft. There are a variety of benefits to software assurance. A common use of it is to make sure that you have access to the latest version of the product, whether that's SQL Server or Windows Server. Today, what we're really going to focus on is the license mobility portion of SA. So that license mobility benefit allows a customer to take licenses that they've purchased on their enterprise agreement and run them in a shared tenant instance in AWS Elastic Compute Cloud. So when you see some of these product names that we've got listed here, SharePoint, Exchange, Skype, Dynamics, these products all have license mobility as a software assurance benefit. So as always, double check with your large account reseller and your Microsoft product use rights in your enterprise agreement. Make sure that you have active software assurance and license mobility for your product. There's a license verification process. I believe we have a link on how to do that in the resources portion of this deck. Within 10 days of your deployment, you need to fill that out. That form goes to Amazon through your large account reseller that manages your Microsoft agreement. So you have the ability to notify us and your large account reseller that you're going to be reassigning those licenses and running them in AWS. So the shared tenant model with the Elastic Compute Cloud does allow for per user as well as per core licensed products. But we're going to talk through the differences of a core and a virtual CPU or vCPU. Products like SQL Server licensed by hyperthreads, not by physical core. So I have a chart in a little bit here where we're going to show you the number of cores that you may need to bring over as you're deploying a product like that. So it's just something to keep in mind. SQL Server does have a minimum of 4 cores per instance. So that's just something to consider when you're looking at deploying SQL into AWS. You want to bring them over in minimum quantities of 4. And then the operating system licenses are not eligible for license mobility. So Windows Server, Windows Client do not have license mobility in the SA benefits. We will talk through how to bring those licenses into AWS a little bit later in the presentation using dedicated hosts and dedicated instances. Desktop products are licensed per user and are also not able to be brought in. So think about Office or Visual Studio as examples. Again, dedicated options exist here. We have an FAQ that details a lot of these scenarios in greater depth on aws.amazon.com/Microsoft/FAQ. That's one of the resources that we'll have at the end of the deck, but just a great bookmark to keep handy as you're going through these different scenarios. So here's the SQL license mobility chart that I mentioned, and what this does is represent the number of hardware threads based on the instance type that you want to deploy in the AWS Elastic Compute Cloud. So you can see we have a range here in the SNP on the slide from the M1 instance to the M4 10XL, right? So from small to 10XL, different hardware thread requirements ranging from 4 to 40 that you need to keep in mind. So there's a link here, and I do believe we will be distributing these slides after the presentation as well, or providing a link to them, that provides you a chart where you can look at this full list of different instance families and the number of hardware threads that you need to license if you're going to bring those licenses into AWS. Okay, as we're moving into the bring your own licensing model, please, if you have any questions about what I just covered on license included, please get those into the Q&A section, and our moderators are standing by ready to answer those questions for you. And thank you for the number of folks who have already submitted questions. I can see that we've got a number that are being answered now, so thank you. So bringing licenses into AWS, how do you do this? Volume licenses can be brought in to dedicated hosts or instances, particularly where you may not have that license mobility benefit that I just mentioned. We're going to talk about the dedicated use case and why and when you'd want to do that. Many customers have made an investment on premises in Microsoft licenses, and they don't want to pay for it again, right? If you've already bought products like SQL or SharePoint or something, maximize those licenses and take advantage of where they're deployed. There's no need to double pay, right? So we want to make sure that you have the ability to import your existing images into the AWS cloud as you migrate your workloads over, as well as bringing your licenses over at the same time. So that's the scenario that we're going to talk through right now. So let me start by talking about the dedicated host. Dedicated host is essentially a server that is aligned to you as a customer that we reserve for you in one of our regions. And we have the ability to provide you with an exposure of what the virtual CPU core count as well as the memory count looks like on that dedicated host. So it's not a bare metal server. There is an abstraction layer through our AWS management and the hypervisor technology that we use, but that host is dedicated to your use. So you have the ability to pay for the compute pricing, and we have it noted here as AWS Linux, so essentially that means no license included, and then you can bring your licenses into it. So for that scenario that I mentioned a moment ago, where you have licenses that don't qualify for license mobility, or you have products like SQL Server that you have not maintained active software assurance on, dedicated host is a great option. You have the ability to have much more visibility into the dedicated host through that processor / core count. Some other ISVs have licensing models that are similar that require this type of visibility, so this is just a good option to keep in mind. You decide where it's going to be running, and you assign the instances that are actually be running inside of that host. So you determine in each dedicated host how many instances you're going to be running. Each one has a different capacity that you determine, right? So you might be able to spin up X number of 4XLs and Y number of 8XL instances in, say, the C4 family, depending on the capacity of that dedicated host. So dedicated host versus multi-tenant EC2 instance. What does this look like? You can see on the left, we've got a representation of our multi-tenant architecture with AWS. And in the multi-tenant model, we have customers running their instances on the same host, segmented and isolated, but AWS determines which host that instance will actually run on, and you pay per instance. So you can see at the bottom, we've got a little visual representation of what each instance looks like. So again, think of this as a box, and the instances are fit into the box. The dedicated host is dedicated to you as the customer, and you make that determination. So it's single tenant. You determine which instances run, and you pay per host. So you have the ability to reuse that. We can place those instances automatically, or you can do what's called targeted placement, where you can determine exactly which dedicated hosts are housing which of your instances. Also very beneficial for licensing, where you may have some shared CPU or core-based licensing products. But you have more visibility into the physical cores and sockets on the dedicated host because it's dedicated just to you as a customer. So some licensing models that align to the dedicated host. First of all, Windows Server, bring your own license. As I mentioned, no license mobility in the product use rights for Windows Server. If you want to bring Windows Server into AWS, you need to be looking at dedicated hosts. MSDN. If you are going to be bringing MSDN licenses in, potentially for dev test purposes or other user acceptance testing functions, other things that you do with MSDN, MSDN is licensed per user. So again, no license mobility. You are required to use dedicated infrastructure to bring that license into AWS. If you are maximizing your virtualization footprint using these products like Windows Server Data Center and SQL Enterprise, where you're licensing the physical cores in the box, then that is something that you're able to take advantage of with dedicated hosts. And anything that's user and server-based licensing deployment. So think about Server Cal, or think about other products that may take advantage of that model. You need to leverage dedicated for that as well. When you have passive failover for SQL, an SA is active. That's another instance where you want to be looking at the dedicated model as well. So here are the product use rights for dedicated outsourcing in the Microsoft licensing language. As I mentioned, you must bring your license in on a dedicated host because there's no license included available on dedicated hosts. And you must activate through your own key management server when you bring your own media into AWS. So when we provide that license included image, as you'll recall earlier, we have an Amazon machine image that has the Windows Server license included in the cost of the compute. We're also activating and taking care of all that. When you're bringing your own or leveraging dedicated hosts to do so, you may need to activate through your on-premises key management server, or you may spin up another key management server in AWS to allow your instances to communicate and make sure that your keys are being activated. So kind of a multi-step process on how to do this. Right. First, you import your VM images using our VM import-export tool from your on-premises environment. Secondly, you can activate the AWS config service. You allocate the dedicated hosts in the console through AWS deployment of a new EC2 instance, and then you launch that instance onto the dedicated host. I'm not going to talk through this whole slide, but just some configuration options to show you the different permutations that you have with dedicated hosts. So you bring the licenses to cover the cores or sockets on the dedicated hosts, and then each Microsoft product has some different licensing rules. So you can see a couple of examples here. Windows Server, 2 instances per physically licensed host. SQL Standard, 1 instance per physically licensed host. SQL Enterprise allows you to maximize your virtualization and license the cores that are on the box, and then deploy a number of SQL Enterprise instances on top of it. When you think about consolidation of the environment, optimization, making sure that you're maximizing that footprint, knowing the not only the dedicated host pricing, but also the product use rights for your Microsoft products, and where you might be able to become more efficient by potentially co-locating a number of databases on a SQL Enterprise box is something that we see customers looking at as part of their well-architected strategy, as well as cost optimization being a big part of that. So a customer example here where customers are using this to move their Microsoft workloads into AWS, become more efficient and save money. We've got Deltek here. They're a software and information provider for various professional services companies. They have the ability to save 15% on their SQL licensing costs, and they're estimating they'll save approximately 10% on Windows licensing by bringing their own licenses and leveraging dedicated hosts. So a key requirement here, you see agility and flexibility, but also regulatory compliance. There are some workloads that have regulatory requirements where that workload must live on a physically separate server, right? Because of the way the legislation may be written or something. You have the ability to look at dedicated hosts as a potential option to help you meet some of those different compliance requirements. So now that I've talked about dedicated hosts, I'm going to cover dedicated instances as well. So dedicated instances allow you to take your on-premises licenses that don't have SA or don't qualify for license mobility and bring them into AWS. You can use Windows Server because it is, again, physically isolated at the host hardware level, and you can use your existing on-premises software to reduce your cost. So the dedicated instances versus multi-tenant EC2, you'll see that we've got a similar comparative graph here. The difference being that you've got the ability to deploy instances as opposed to the entire host and decide where they're going to live. On dedicated hosts, in dedicated instances, AWS determines which host the instances will run on, but that instance, as you can see represented by the smaller image at the bottom left of your slide there, is deployed and dedicated to you. So you pay per instance in the dedicated instance model as opposed to per host, and there is a regional fee associated with deploying dedicated instances as well. So a couple of areas where dedicated instances may be a better fit for licensing. MSDN, as I mentioned, since that's per user, you do have the ability to bring MSDN licenses in on dedicated instances as well as dedicated hosts. If you're going to bring in the desktop OS or Microsoft Office, dedicated instances are also something that you can consider. The SQL Server OSE licenses are also able to be run on dedicated instances, but keep in mind, the Windows Server license is not eligible because there's no license mobility and the way the product use rights are written for Windows Server. If you're going to bring Windows Server in, you must use the dedicated host option. So again, different configuration options on dedicated instances. As you can see, there are a number of different permutations here. Software assurance is not required for these licenses, and you do have a number of user-based products such as MSDN and Office that you can bring in without worrying about how many virtual CPUs are allocated to that particular instance that you're going to deploy. But again, SQL Server, if you're going to leverage dedicated instances, just keep in mind the 4 core minimum that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Now I'm going to speak to the folks on the phone that are service providers. So you may have your own service provider license agreement or SPLA with Microsoft that you're using to resell licenses. We want to cover how to use your own SPLA in AWS. So this is an option where you are providing a service to another customer. So sometimes this is a hoster, sometimes this is a company that has built a software as a service solution where they are reselling that to their end users, and they're taking advantage of the SPLA program through Microsoft for those licenses. So if you think about application service providers, ISVs, web hosters, these are all very common. The interesting draw here is the pay-as-you-go model, right? You don't have to make upfront commitments. You license based on how your business grows, and you have the ability to scale up or scale down as appropriate. You can't use these licenses on multi-tenant EC2. You have the ability to you can. You have the ability to do this because AWS is referred to as a data center provider in the product use rights. So if you're a SPLA consumer and you're using those SPLA licenses, double check your product use rights. You'll see the data center provider section. AWS falls into that area. Some of the eligible products in the SPLA include Microsoft Office, remote desktop services, some of the other products that we've talked about earlier, like Exchange. There are certain products that are designated that can be run in the shared tenancy. On the product sheet in your SPLA agreement, look for this DCP eligible portion notation on the products to indicate whether those are available or not. You can license the SPLA products by core or by physical processor, and you can deploy them on dedicated hosts as well if you would like to. So the qualification for self-hosting allows you to use your volume licenses agreement, a license agreement to offer a software as a service based solution to your customers. If you look in the product use terms under software assurance, there's some pretty specific language that lays this out. The deployments for AWS allow you to potentially deploy Windows that you could purchase through a license included instance on AWS, and other products could be purchased through Microsoft with software assurance and then brought into AWS. So you can mix and match a little bit here. The license mobility allows you to make that scenario possible. So just being cognizant of time here, I do want to make sure that we are able to cover some of these common solutions that we're seeing customers use their Microsoft licenses for as they bring them into AWS. So let's talk about failover first. So SQL 2014 allows for passive failover benefits. So if you have active software assurance, you do have the ability to deploy a passive failover node with SQL Server. You can leverage this benefit when you bring those licenses into AWS. If you don't have active software assurance on SQL Server, both the active and the passive nodes need to be separately licensed. When you bring your licenses in, you have the ability to configure that and set that up. Of course, both have to be licensed. When we provide you with the license included option, we have no way of telling whether you're using that in production or not, so we need to charge you for the use of SQL Server. So when you're talking about an active-passive configuration, this is definitely something that we suggest you looking at the options to bring those licenses in so that you're maximizing your spend. If you're using dedicated hardware on that active instance, then the passive is also required to be on dedicated hardware as well. And then the matching also needs to be the same on what we call the third-party shared servers or the multi-tenant environment as well. You don't need to buy any additional SQL licenses, but you may need additional Windows Server compute to run the passive instance as well. A couple other quick areas that we do get a lot of questions about from customers. First of all, Exchange Server is eligible for license mobility. SQL Server with the per core licensing, as well as the server and Cal model, and SharePoint is eligible for license mobility as well. Mixed licensing model. This is really getting into more of the strategy on how you leverage your licensing. And a lot of times customers say, what should I do? Should I take advantage of AWS license included, or should I bring all my licenses in? Very often, it makes sense for customers to take advantage of both models. So if you've already got an investment in, say, SQL Enterprise licenses, by all means, right, figure out a way to bring those into AWS and take advantage of those running in the cloud without having to repurchase them. For new projects, you may want to look at the cost benefits of licensing through the license included option with AWS and leveraging our service provider license agreement. The flexibility of spinning up and spinning down instances is also something to consider, where if again, as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to need that as a steady state workload. You may see more flexibility by being able to turn it on and then turn it back off and only pay for what you've used. The auto scaling capabilities in the AWS platform allow for that to be done in a fairly automated way, and you do have the pay-as-you-go flexibility there. So many times with a new project, customers can run the numbers and look at purchasing on their existing Microsoft volume license agreement, purchasing through the AWS license included option, or possibly even a hybrid of those two, right? A permutation where you purchase the license included Windows Server instance and then you bring, say, SQL Server as a product on top of that Windows Server image. So in conclusion, we want to just sum this up with the real key takeaways, and then we're going to go into some Q&A about the Microsoft licensing on AWS for any areas that we weren't able to cover during the Q&A moderator's time during the presentation. So for license included instances, you can use those for on-demand, spot, or reserved instances. They're pay-as-you-go. They can run on both multi-tenant and dedicated instances. We provide you the images. We support legacy versions of the Microsoft products through the Amazon Machine Image Catalog. We manage the licensing and the compliance of that for you. With license mobility, as the benefit in active software assurance products like SQL Server, remote desktop services, and Exchange, you have the ability to bring those licenses into AWS. Does not include Windows Server, does not include Windows Client, does not include Office. There is a verification process. You need to fill out a form. You can email Microsoft@Amazon.com if you have any more detailed questions about how that license mobility process works, but you have the ability to import and bring your own software into AWS. And through Bring Your Own License, we do have dedicated instance and dedicated host options. No software assurance is required. You can bring Windows Server in and run it on AWS through dedicated hosts. You are responsible for the compliance of your environment, right? So you need to double check your product use rights as you're doing that. The real flexibility or power of being able to bring your own image that you manage and maintain on premises and be able to kind of extend that into AWS is something that we see benefiting a lot of customers. So a couple of references here. I've got some links here on the dedicated hosts and the dedicated instances. And then we've also got our Microsoft FAQ that I mentioned earlier and the license mobility verification form. So you can follow that link and check that out as well. So I believe that brings us to the end of the presentation.